Not long ago, a top-ranking U.S. general said Americans must be ready to fight and die for Israel. So you might be asking yourself, why? Why would we send American soldiers to die in Israel? A friend of mine reminded me of this today, actually, this General Clark. You're probably smart enough to wonder, by now you are, what's the real reason that the United States and Israel are taking over Gaza? Is it really about Hamas, as neocons and Netanyahu would have us believe, or is Hamas the perfect cover to seize control of massive natural gas deposits that Palestinians own and control offshore, off the shore of Gaza and the Gaza Strip? Call me cynical, but I have heard this story before. Western powers using the cover of terrorism to seize control over massive oil and gas resources and oceanfront property so they can build ports. There's a reason we don't give a shit about landlocked Afghanistan, but we are building a second military base in Iraq, and where we're building that military base is right on or right next to Iraqi oil fields. So, of course, I thought we weren't in Iraq anymore. Like, why? And we're now building a second base, but this time it's right near oil fields. So we need to make sure we have control of that oil. Last week, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was asked, how long will Israeli forces occupy Gaza after it's been destroyed? His response wasn't a surprise to me at all, or anybody watching this show, I'm sure. Watch.
President Biden has said that it would be a mistake for Israel to occupy Gaza. Who should govern Gaza when this is over?
Those who don't want to continue the way of Hamas. It certainly is not. I think Israel will, for an indefinite period, will have the overall security responsibility, because we've seen what happens when we don't have it. When we don't have that security responsibility, what we have is the eruption of Hamas terror on a scale that we couldn't imagine.
Yeah, so of course they will occupy it indefinitely, even after Hamas is long gone, because it was never about Hamas in the first place. Wake up. They're playing us like a fiddle once again. They love nothing more than to watch people argue on Twitter. You're an anti-Semite. You're pro-Palestinian. Does Israel have the right to exist? You don't think Israel has a right to exist? What's wrong with you? Stop killing babies. These elites are running around. They're running the show right now. They're just laughing all the way to the bank because their plan is rolling out exactly the way they want for everyone to be fighting about it. While innocent people, of course, are being killed. They don't really care about innocent people at all. And the same thing happened in Iraq. Millions of Iraqi civilians died as a result. Thousands of American soldiers died in this boondoggle. And remember Madeleine Albright when asked about collateral damage of children? When civilians are being killed, children are being killed. What were her exact words?
She said it was worth it.
It was worth it.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died when in Hiroshima. And is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
So this is how they think. They don't really give a rat's behind about you. They care about their long-term plans. And we warned on this show from the very beginning of the Israeli conflict to beware of false flags. So let's come back to this whole thing in a second here. But first, some context around natural gas. Over the past week, it started getting cold in Europe. And this weekend, Europe started using that natural gas. It's stored up as a safety mechanism against an energy disaster that could face Europe. Across the board, countries in the EU started drawing supplies in order to heat homes and businesses. Then temperatures went back up a little bit in certain areas. But as soon as temperatures fall again, the same thing is going to happen. Tapping into this backup supply after the United States destroyed Europe's Nord Stream pipeline. It was a brilliant move by the United States, cut off Europe's flow of cheap natural gas from Russia and force Europe to buy it from the United States. It's a brilliant move, right? It's a brilliant business move. And that's exactly what happened. Europe started paying nearly double the prices that they used to pay to Russia. U.S. companies started turning record profits. Last year, Europe became the #1 destination for natural gas sales for U.S. companies, setting a new record. Look at this chart. This chart's amazing. Instead of a simple pipeline delivering gas to Germany and Europe, look at this. Now this massive spike to Europe from United States liquefied gas exports. surging, of course, now to Europe. Instead of a simple pipeline delivering gas to Germany and Europe, now the United States puts it on liquefied natural gas on ships like this, and it transports it across the ocean. There's your green plan. That's a brilliant idea, right? We're all about environmental concerns. So instead of a clean gas pipeline that delivers it, no, let's go through all of the extra legwork and cost.
What a
carbon footprint and putting it on a boat.
On diesel.
But probably, what else is going to? It's not solar panels, right? I wonder if it runs on natural gas. Actually, that'd be brilliant.
And like,
Well, it
hey,
usually is a
can-
cleaner source of energy, but not if you ship it, all the way around the world. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, add in the extra layer of carbon.
Yeah, exactly. And I was just going to say it, but it gives them a reason to not have to listen to people up in arms about fracking. They're like, we don't need to listen to these people anymore. We can get it overseas and not have to fight these people.
Yeah, we don't have to do it in our own backyard. We'll just buy it from America where they do fracking. So American companies are putting this liquefied natural gas on these ships, transporting it across the ocean. Europe pays almost 50% more. Anywhere, I mean, the prices range anywhere from like 35% more up to 50% more. Remember, German politicians outraged. They're like, why the hell are we buying our stuff now from America? We played you those sound bites here, members of the German Bundestag. So, in fact, right after the United States blew up the pipeline, natural gas exports to Europe exploded. Look at this chart. Look at the blue bars to the right of your screen, and look how China and Asia declined in American exports. China started getting it more from Russia. Of course, the Belt and Road Initiative is going to help all of that, right? And Europe started getting all of their natural gas from the United States. And it's about to get much worse. According to Bloomberg, demand for natural gas is set to rise through the region, not going to slow down anytime soon. In fact, according to the EU's top energy official, says that the U.S. gas will be needed for decades. Decades. U.S. gas will be needed for decades to come, and without it, EU would face disaster, they admit. It's amazing how that happens. So then let's circle back to Gaza and a couple of points here, just so we have that context there. In the year 2000, there was a shocking discovery made right off the coast of Gaza in Palestinian-controlled ocean waters. It just so happened that geologists found a massive natural gas deposit. Whoa, really? So this deposit could transform a country, transform it, lift it out of poverty, completely alter it. Just look what it did to Norway in the 1960s. Norway, of course, went from being a poor fishing country to the most economically advanced country in the world. Norway leads every major category, from healthcare to life expectancy to income to safety, all thanks to oil, and they get to keep their own oil. Imagine that. They find it, they bring it out of the ocean, they get to keep the profits. Isn't that a novel idea?
I mean, Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, that's what Venezuela wanted to do. They wanted to basically give the oil back to the people, and America was like, no, we have too much interest in your oil down there. Let's form a coup.
Yeah,
Right.
They did have to, in Norway, fight the United Kingdom for rights to some of those Black Sea deposits. So it wasn't as easy as that, but they won most of it.
Yeah. Well, it turns out Britain has very long tendrils, which we'll see here in a second. So imagine, though, if African countries got to keep their own oil instead of the United States, France, and the UK. Can you imagine that? These African countries?
Every dictator that has imagined that found itself on the business end of a U.S. bomb.
Yeah, a business end of a coup, right? And those that are in power, of course, have aligned themselves with the UK government, with France, with the United States, mostly in Britain and France. And so all of the money and riches, of course, flows out into Europe rather than into those African countries, of course. So could you imagine a prosperous Africa? What would that look like? You can't, because we steal all their resources and their wealth. So you can't imagine that. But we'll do Christmas songs, to raise money for feeding kids in Africa. We'll do Christmas songs, and we'll get like Bono and Sting together, and we'll do those Christmas songs, and that'll raise money for them. So I'm sure that's the same thing as having billions of dollars in oil profits. Well, the same thing is about to happen to Gaza. As Jana points out here, the field was discovered in 2000 by BG Group. But as of 2021, its exploitation is still subject to negotiations. It's been estimated that Gaza Marine which is a deposit, contains upwards of 1 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. 1 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. And RT just did a great report on this Palestinian gas that sits right next to Gaza and the oil in the West Bank. Check this out.
You probably wouldn't know it, but Gaza is rich, gas rich, at least 1.4 trillion cubic feet rich, to be precise. But there's a catch.
Geologists and natural resources economists have confirmed that the occupied Palestinian territory lies above sizable reservoirs of oil and natural gas wealth in Area C of the occupied West Bank and the Mediterranean coast off the Gaza Strip. To date, the real and opportunity costs of the occupation exclusively in the area of oil and natural gas have accumulated to tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars.
Back in 1999, the Palestinian authorities signed a deal with British Gas. Just off the Gaza coast, they struck it lucky, and 2 wells were drilled. That's Gaza Marine 1 and 2. It was a multi-billion-dollar gift from God, an economic boon both home and abroad.
This is one of the key messages here today. There will be gas available for export. And from my conversations with Palestinian officials, including President Arafat, it is clear that they have no interest in just sitting on a gas surplus.
Fast forward to 2007, Hamas comes to power, and Israel launches an offensive on the Gaza Strip, leaving behind 1,400 dead Palestinians, but taking with it the gas fields. Now, within the year, Israel announced the discovery of the Leviathan natural gas field, which did include Gaza's riches, all in all valued at $453 billion.
So imagine what they could do with that money. In 2011, Israel tried to take control over the natural gas deposits that belonged to the Palestinians. So Israel tried to step in and swoop in and take the money and the wealth associated with those natural gas deposits and oil. Even Wikipedia, we know how corrupt Wikipedia is, right? Even Wikipedia explains how this went down. How under peace negotiations, Israel asked for control of all fuel and revenues destined for Gaza and the West Bank. That was about 12 years ago. So just to underline that point, hey, we're trying to find some common ground here in these peace negotiations, and as part of the negotiations, you want all of my oil and natural gas. How exactly does that work? So you want us to admit that Israel exists as a country.
And also admit that Israel has historical rights to the territory as well. Israel only asks the Palestinians to acknowledge that. They don't ask any other country to acknowledge that. That's part of the continued way that they kind of bomb these negotiations.
And also give us all of your oil and gas and the wealth associated with it. Well, of course, surprisingly, the Palestinians rejected that offer. Still, the natural gas just sits there. Why? Well, Shell, BG Group, which is now Shell, backed out under pressure from Israel, and no other company wants to touch it for fear of being blacklisted by Israel. Why won't BP touch it? Why won't Exxon touch it? Well, if you do, you'll feel the wrath of the Israeli government. In the meantime, Israel wants to become a new distributor of natural gas to Europe at the same time that Russian gas has been cut off. Iran is sanctioned and Syria is under U.S. occupation, squatting on their oil reserves. So in 2022, Israel's energy minister said this.
This is a historical moment in which the small country of Israel becomes a significant player in the global energy market. The Memorandum of Understanding will enable Israel, for the first time, to export Israeli natural gas to Europe. And it is even more impressive looking at the significant set of agreements we signed over the last year, which position Israel and the Israeli energy and water sectors as a key global player.
Oh, okay. So, it turns out... Go ahead.
Does that mean Jason Bourne that we talked about yesterday potentially worked for Israel?
Going down and looking
to blow up the Nord Stream pipeline?
Perhaps, in fact, that is true. So, turns out that Palestinians have long been in the way, as a now declassified memo from July of 1963 shows us. Israel, of course, rolled out a plan to build the Ben Gurion Canal. As some of you in the chat have been pointing out, St. Clayton, do not forget about the Ben Gurion Canal. Yes, we're not forgetting about it. Here we are to talk about it because they can't control the Suez Canal. So build one themselves, the Ben Gurion Canal, that connects the Mediterranean Sea with the Gulf and connects the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean as a result. And by the way, the Suez Canal, of course, and the Straits of Hormuz, the Suez Canal, by all accounts, now under the control of BRICS, right? BRICS nations. So, of course, like this plan is still there, and you would absolutely want to have control of your own canal and the transport. As the memo points out from 1963, they would use nuclear explosives to clear the site, which conveniently sits next to where Palestinians live, and they would use conventional explosives then in Gaza, where it's a more populated area. This is literally in the memo, and I'll quote it exactly from the Israeli government at the bottom of your screen here. Approximately 130 miles of the 160-mile length of the route are in virtually unpopulated desert wasteland and are thus amenable to nuclear excavation methods. Conventional methods could be used in the vicinity of the populated areas and near the coastal plain near Gaza. So that's all right there. You can read the nuclear explosives used for the creation of the Ben Gurion Canal. Here's what it would have looked like right there. Of course, you can see it going right through Gaza. So they would have control. So it is remarkable that Gaza is rich in recently discovered natural gas and oil. It's very curious then why Western leaders are totally fine with Israel invading Gaza and the West Bank to take indefinite control over these oil-rich areas. And this is all happening while Europe needs a lot of natural gas. And the United States just blew up their pipeline. This has nothing to do with terrorism. It has everything to do with money and the control of natural resources. Let me know your thoughts on this in the comments below. I think they like to wrap themselves in a blanket of terrorism, and that's how they justify these things. And absolutely, this is not to downplay what happened on October 7th. Yes, horrible, absolutely devastating what happened on October 7th. What happened on September 11th was absolutely horrible and devastating. But it's the response and it's the underlying politics at play here that are driving all of this, I believe.
Right. And I don't understand how people who are pro the Israeli response continue to use 9/11 as if it is a successful roadmap.
From my experience in the military with a top secret clearance, working in counterterrorism, working in psychological operations, working in the State Department, working in a presidential administration, and working in a defense contractor, who's very familiar with the CIA. And what we see, if we just look at the facts and the evidence, is this trauma-based mind control that's been existing in the United States and Europe since September 11th, 2001, is just simply metastasized and evolved into different messages, different enemies, with a single agenda of reforming the entire Middle East, which is part of a Israeli long-term policy of expanding itself. We really know there is no threat. There is no enemy. This is just a game. This is a ploy. This is part of a smoke and mirror charade. This is a psychological operation that France is very well known and familiar with, and the CIA is very well known and familiar with, and Mossad is very well known and familiar with. Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So we've seen history proves that the United States being supposedly attacked on September 11th, 2001, was really a false flag, which is conducted by Israeli Mossad operations in tandem with CIA operations and involving Saudi Arabian participation for a larger neoconservative agenda of replacing the governments in Libya, Syria, Iraq, Somalia, Lebanon, and eventually Iran.
Like, right. Hey, the United States had 9/11. They waged 20 years of war on the Middle East and killed millions of civilians. That was fine. So Israel should do it too. 9/11 should be a cautionary tale of how not to respond. So I don't understand these comparisons as if, an Israeli minister this weekend said, well, no one put a time limit on, America's response to 9/11. That's not a good thing. That's not something that we should be emulating. Or anyone should be saying, that was good, we'll do it like they did.
I mean, Israel really wants to become the hub of oil and natural gas in that area. They want to be the ones that are providing the oil and gas to Europe.
Right.
They want to be the hub.
This scenario is borne out by none other than Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, one of the great founders of Israel. Recorded in an astonishing article in Look magazine, Ben-Gurion predicted that a one-world system presided over by Jerusalem will be set up in the near future. All continents will become united in a world alliance, at whose disposal will be an international police force. All armies will be abolished, and there will be no more war. In Jerusalem, the United Nations, a truly United Nations, will build a shrine of the prophets to serve the federated union of all continents. This will be the seat of the Supreme Court of mankind, to settle all controversies among the federated continents as prophesied by Isaiah.
Yeah.
And they want to be able to make that money off of selling oil and natural gas into Germany, and forget Russia. Now that Russia, of course, is pipeline destroyed, Syria and Iran under sanctions, right? As RT reported, so that opens up Israel. Instead of having to ship it all the way from the United States, you could have this hub for Israel with all of that natural gas and oil that you could sell and make a lot of billions of dollars off of. So are the Palestinians ever going to get back control of this oil and gas?
Right, especially as the end goal is to occupy that region or get them all out. Are they going to let them work from abroad? Hey,
you can work remotely.
Yeah, work remotely. We're
going to push you out into the Sinai Desert in a tent. You can live in tents.
But you still can manage your oil and gas exports.
Right. Let's see how that's going to go.
Right.
Let's believe that if we see it. Yeah, I don't know.
We'll know how sizable it is, though, when the U.S. steps in to protect Israel's oil.
Like they did in Syria. Yeah, like they do in Syria. They're going to step in.
Like we do in Syria and Iraq. If you've got oil, we want to protect it. We're here for you.
One of the most closely guarded secrets of the Cold War was America's role in supporting Afghan warlords known as the Mujahedeen. The official story is that America backed these fundamentalists in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979. But that's not true. It was 6 months before the Soviet invasion, in July of that year, that President Jimmy Carter authorized $500 million to help set up the Mujahedeen, a terrorist organization. The American people were completely unaware that their government, together with the British Secret Service, MI6, had begun training and funding Islamic extremists, including Osama bin Laden. Out of this came the Taliban, AlQaeda, and September the 11th. Soon after the Taliban came to power in 1996, the administration of Bill Clinton backed a secret plan for a pipeline through Afghanistan from Central Asia, which has vast reserves of oil and gas. The Taliban were offered a generous cut in the deal and secretly invited to Washington and Texas. They were treated royally, taken shopping and flown to tourist attractions like the NASA Space Center and Mount Rushmore. Their tour was so secret that no television news covered it. Most Americans knew nothing. By the time George W. Bush came to power, the link between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban was an embarrassment, and September the 11th gave Bush an opportunity to get rid of them. Today, Afghanistan is run by a regime installed by the Americans, and the pipeline deal is going ahead. September the 11th also presented an opportunity to an influential group who, even by Republican Party standards, were extreme. Ray McGovern is a former senior officer of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, and a personal friend of George Bush Sr., the president's father.
These same people who are running U.S. policy now are people that the president's father kept at arm's length. They were referred to in the circles in which I moved when I was briefing at the top intelligence and policy levels. They were referred to as the crazies. The crazies. I mean, you talk about the crazies, everyone knew who they were. Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, Doug Feith, those folks.
The crazies also include Donald Rumsfeld, seen here in Baghdad in 1986, warmly greeting Saddam Hussein, who was then being armed to the teeth by America and Britain. This is one of their blueprints, published in 2000 by the extreme right-wing group Project for a New American Century. The US military will fight multiple simultaneous wars as the cavalry on the new American frontier. The principal author is William Crystal.
The problem with America is not that we go around marauding around the world imposing ourselves. The problem with America in the last 10, 15 years since the end of the Cold War, really in the last 60 years, is that we've been too slow to get involved in conflicts.
Outside America, people have worried about the United States conducting an unprovoked attack on a country, a sovereign country.
Are they? Are they?
Yes, they are.
Really? They're worried we're going to attack Britain, France, Germany, any democracy?
No, because...
Any decent regime?
No, the United States doesn't usually attack strong countries.
Do we attack decent countries?
No, I said strong countries.
Well, I was asking decent countries.
I don't know
Are
what
people
you would
really
call,
worried the U.S. is going to go, a decent, law-abiding country, and the U.S. is going to come in and say, we don't like the look of you, we're going to depose you? Is that something the U.S. has done quite often? How many countries has the U.S. attacked in the last 15 years?
Well, since World War II, there have been 72 interventions by the United States.
Oh, is that right?
Yes.
That's ludicrous.
Well, it's not ludicrous, it's true.
These are some of the countries where the United States, directly and indirectly, has overthrown governments, manipulated elections, and attacked popular movements since 1945. Bush's war on terror is just another brand name replacing the Red Menace as justification for a systematic aggression. This is well documented, yet it remains a kind of secret history, seldom reported in the West as a war of terror.
I think we can all agree that ISIS is the worst of the worst.
They're more extreme even than Al-Qaeda.
A savagery unseen.
This is an evil, sadistic, monstrous enemy.
But the truth is that there would be no ISIS had it not been for the American-led invasion of Iraq, because ISIS is blowback. Remember 2003? We won the war in Iraq. A brutal dictator was toppled, Iraqis celebrated in the streets, and George Bush declared mission accomplished. But of course, it wasn't, and in fact that mission led both directly and indirectly to the founding of ISIS in 2013. How so? Well, to start, foreign military occupations breed violent insurgencies. They always have, they always will. Within weeks of the fall of Saddam Hussein, US soldiers had morphed from heroic liberators to brutal occupiers. In Fallujah, which would later become an ISIS stronghold, US troops opened fire on a crowd of peaceful protesters, killing and wounding dozens. At Abu Ghraib, the US military rounded up hundreds of Iraqis, many of them completely innocent, and tortured them in horrific ways. The shootings, the torture, the general chaos helped drive thousands of Iraqis, especially from the minority Sunni community, into the arms of radical groups led by brutal gangsters such as Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the same groups, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, ISI, that would later coalesce into ISIS. Next, in a criminally stupid and self-defeating move, the US occupying authorities disbanded the Iraqi army overnight, a move that shocked even senior Bush administration officials back in Washington, D.C.
This idea to disband the entire army was one that came as quite a surprise to me. We had a lot of out-of-work soldiers.
Yep, 500,000 or so Iraqi men, not just unemployed and pissed off at the Americans, but well-trained and heavily armed. Overnight, they became what Colin Powell would later call prime recruits for insurgency, as one ludicrously eloquent and informed college student told President Bush's younger brother Jeb not so long ago.
The threat of ISIS was created by the Iraqi Coalition Authority, which ousted the entire government of Iraq. Your brother created ISIS.
Today, it's no coincidence that much of the top leadership of ISIS consists of former top officers in Saddam's army, or former army. Now, I know what you're thinking. How did secular Baathists, Saddam's people, end up fighting alongside Salafi jihadists? Well, the answer again is blowback. The US helped introduce them to one another. Which leads me to my last point, Camp Bucca. That's the name of the post-war US detention facility in southern Iraq, in which around 100,000 Iraqi men were held. Again, many of them were completely innocent. It's where jihadists, ex-soldiers, and yes, ordinary Iraqis met networked, recruited, and radicalized in what a Camp Bucca guard would later call a pressure cooker for extremism.
What Camp Bucca and other military facilities ended up being luxury radicalization centers.
It then became a management seminar for upper echelons of ISIS.
There were large numbers of people who weren't against them in the first place when they went into Bucca, who were very much against them when they were released.
Oh dear. One former Bucca detainee was none other than Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. You might have heard of him. He's the founder of ISIS. Yeah, that guy. According to Iraqi terrorism expert 𝗧𝗿𝗶𝗁𝗲𝗄𝗆, the loathsome Baghdadi got more radicalized while in US detention, where he, quote, absorbed the jihadist ideology and established himself. Thanks, Camp Bucca. To recap, the US built, ran, supervised a recruitment center for the guys who would go on to create ISIS. Madness.
Him and others were able to write their contact details on the white elastic of their boxer shorts, their prison-issued boxer shorts, and that was a way that they networked.
As one former ISIS commander told The Guardian, if there was no American prison in Iraq, there would be no ISIS now. Bucca was a factory. It made us all. It built our ideology. Now you might say, of course an ISIS commander is going to blame the Americans for everything. Of course he's going to say that. But it isn't just him. Listen to David Kilcullen, former advisor to both General David Petraeus and Condoleezza Rice, and widely considered to be one of the world's leading experts on counterinsurgency.
Biggest strategic screw-up since the invasion of Russia by Hitler in 1941 was the decision to invade Iraq in 2003. There undeniably would be no ISIS if we had not invaded Iraq.
Ooh. Listen also to the former President of the United States.
ISIL is a direct outgrowth of al-Qaeda in Iraq that grew out of our invasion, which is an example of unintended consequences.
Unintended consequences, aka blowback. But the current President of the United States has his own theory. He's claimed ISIS is a result of the withdrawal of US forces from Iraq by Obama in 2011.
The way he got out of Iraq was the founding of ISIS. I mean, with his bad policies, that's why ISIS came about. If he would have done things properly, you wouldn't have had ISIS. True. Therefore, he was the founder of ISIS.
As is so often the case, Trump has it backwards. It wasn't the getting out, it was the going in.
At this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
There was no ISIS in Iraq before we invaded. We helped put ISIS in Iraq and beyond. Yes, the Iraqi government's corruption and the Syrian government's repression also contributed to the rise of ISIS, as did a vicious Salafi jihadi ideology funded by some in the Gulf. But you can't get away from the original sin of 2003 and the blowback from that invasion. So when it comes to the world's worst terrorist group, remember, we sowed the wind and now we all reap the whirlwind. The Palestinian militant group Hamas has carried out brutal acts of terror against Israeli civilians, and Israeli and American leaders are always keen to tell us how dangerous and evil Hamas is.
The inhumanity of Hamas.
I have no sympathy for Hamas.
That keep shelling Israel with thousands of rockets and mortar shells.
But what if I told you that Israel helped create Hamas? Officially, Hamas, which is the acronym for an Arabic phrase meaning Islamic resistance movement, was founded in 1987, at the start of the first Palestinian Intifada, or uprising against the Israeli occupation. But its roots were planted much earlier. The Hamas founder Sheikh Ahmed Yassin was a half-blind, disabled Palestinian cleric and member of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Brotherhood had been repressed by the Egyptians in Gaza prior to 1967, but once the Israelis invaded and occupied the Strip, they didn't just turn a blind eye to these Islamists, they encouraged them. See, the Israelis, especially right-wing Israelis, wanted to undermine the power of the dominant Palestinian political force at that time, the nationalist PLO, at the heart of which was the secular Fatah party of Yasser Arafat, their bête noire.
بغصن الزيتون في يدي وببندقية الثائر في يدي
By empowering Sheikh Yassin and the Muslim Brotherhood, Israeli leaders thought they could divide and rule the occupied Palestinians, play them off against each other, secular nationalists against religious Islamists. So in 1978, when Yassin wanted to officially register his Islamic Association, which was basically the precursor to Hamas, the Israelis were only too keen to help. Yassin built and grew a network of Islamist social institutions across Gaza, including schools and clubs and mosques, and Israel helped fund some of those projects. Most American politicians have no clue about any of this, although the former Republican Congressman Ron Paul once made this point on the floor of the House.
Hamas was encouraged and really started by Israel because they wanted Hamas to counteract Yasser Arafat.
Arafat himself told an Italian newspaper, quote, "Hamas is a creature of Israel." He even claimed that former Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin admitted as much to him, calling it a fatal error. Now, you might be wondering, why should I believe mad Ron Paul or the famously shady Yasser Arafat? Well, you don't have to. You can believe top Israeli and US officials who've basically owned up to all this. Brigadier Yitzhak Segev, for example, who was the Israeli military governor in Gaza, and later told a New York Times reporter that he helped finance the Islamic movement. "The Israeli government gave me a budget," he said, "and the military government gives to the mosques." Colonel David Hakam, who worked in Gaza in the late 1980s as an Arab affairs expert in the Israeli military, has admitted that the original sin was Israeli support for Yassin in the late 70s. But at the time, he has argued, nobody thought about the possible results. Well, Avner Cohen did. Cohen was the Israeli official who was responsible for religious affairs in Gaza for more than 2 decades, and who now says, quote, "Hamas, to my great regret, is Israel's creation." Yeah, Cohen's words. He actually wrote an official report to his superiors in the mid-1980s, warning them not to play divide and rule in the occupied territories and calling on Israel to, quote, "break up this monster before this reality jumps in our face." But no one else on the Israeli side really took the possibility of blowback seriously at that time. They never do they? Hamas has since killed far more Israeli civilians than any secular Palestinian militant group, and its leaders have been pretty viciously anti-Israeli and even anti-Semitic in their rhetoric.
لن نعترف بإسرائيل. لا مكان لكم بيننا ولا مستقبل لكم بين الأمم. إنكم إلى زوال.
Sheikh Yassin would eventually be assassinated by an Israeli airstrike in Gaza.
Sheikh Yassin and its organization, the Hamas, are responsible to the killings of more than 400 Israelis. So the question shouldn't be why now. I think it should be why not before.
Why not before? Well, because before, Israel was actually nudging and winking at Yassin and co., building them up as a rival to Arafat's Fatah. The die was cast for blowback. Blowback, incidentally, that they decided to double down on when they assassinated Yassin.
You can hear the crowds chanting for Hamas, and any idea that this operation would actually suppress or diminish that organization seems to be ill-judged.
The inconvenient truth is that Hamas is in part a creature of Israel's own making, an enemy that Israel spent more than 20 years helping to build up, and then spent the next 20 years, the past 20 years that is, trying to bomb, besiege, and blockade out of existence. The 3 Gaza wars fought by Israel against Hamas since 2008 killed around 2,000 Palestinian civilians and a dozen Israeli civilians. That's the real human cost of blowback. David Long, a former Middle East expert at the US State Department under Ronald Reagan, told journalist Robert Dreyfus, "I thought the Israelis were playing with fire. I didn't realize they'd end up creating a monster. But I don't think you ought to mess around with potential fanatics. It's a lesson both the Israelis and the Americans never seem to learn, though. And as usual, innocent people, in this case Palestinians and Israelis, continue to lose their lives as a result."